With the good must come the bad. Yin and yang. Good and evil. Neither can exist without the other. Forever in conflict, forever butting heads, forever engaged in the internal war with each other. This is Afrodo's top 5 worst books of 2022. Get ready. Hey everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, telling you which books deserve Mount Doom. Now, for those of you who've already seen, I recently did a video called the top 5 best books of 2022. And that's why I go through the best books that I read personally in 2022 for the first time that I thought were the best of the best. Now, hopefully you've all enjoyed that video so far. I thought that without also talking about the worst books, it would not be complete. So let's buck up and let's see what books did I think were the worst of last year. Now, for those of you who have seen my best books of the year, the rules are pretty much going to be the same. But for a quick recap, 1, it has to be a book that I read this year. It can't be a book that I reread, or it's not necessarily caged within books that only came out this year. It is specifically a book that I picked up and read for the very first time in the year of 2022. 2, I had to finish them. Now, this is definitely going to be a bit more of a controversial one compared to the best one, but I had to have finished them. That way I can say the book does not suddenly get better after a certain point. The book is bad all the way through. Now, I say this because there are a couple books I did DNF this year because they were just not very good. Now, they'll pop up in the dishonorable mentions. You'll find out what those are. But for the most part, I had to have finished the book. That rule is still there. But with those 2 rules in place, let's get on to the list. The list I know you're all waiting for. Number 5. Off-World by Robin Parrish. Off-World was the second review that I ever did on this channel. And it's a perfect example of a book that has a very interesting premise that kind of ends up just shooting itself in the foot. Now, Off-World is by far not one. It's probably the most competently written book I'm going to have on this list. It's unfortunately. So I just realized right now that I forgot to put on a button-down shirt for the occasion. I just kind of got into it. So everyone enjoy Dragon Ball for this video. Anyways, Off-World is the tale of a group of astronauts who went to Mars on a mission and have returned to find Earth completely abandoned. As I mentioned in my review way back when, it sort of comes off as a premise between The Martian by Andy Weir mixed with Gone by Michael Grant. Now, that interested me enough that I picked it up and I read through it. I was wondering what it could have done with that premise because it is very interesting. And unfortunately, as time went on, I could tell that the author who wrote this book really didn't think through it a lot. One such thing is that all the astronauts in this book very clearly were meant to be soldiers. And I do know that a lot of astronauts have military backgrounds, but the way that the astronauts themselves function is more like a military unit. There's also a character in there who is, unironically, again, from The Division by Tom Clancy. It may not be the exact same organization tit for tat, but it is pretty much the same organization. You also had an overcomplicated plot where the main villain, well, there was actually a main villain who did all this because he wants to disarm the world from nuclear weapons, or, kinda. And you had a very bad leader who was the epitome of what people think leaders should be, but would actually make a very bad leader in real life. One who feels like he has to do everything better than everyone, won't accept his limits, and even when his squad is better suited to tasks at hand, he tries to do them. One such example is when one of the characters has to point a gun at him and force him to sit out while he basically has broken ribs and can barely stand, while he goes to get a helicopter. Mind you, at this, I'm not going to get too into it. If you want to see more, I would suggest watching the review. I've gone so into it because it is one of my older reviews, and the way I used to do reviews back then might be a bit harder to watch compared to now. There's just so much. This book just has an ever mounting wrong, wrong, wrong. It eventually culminates with it suddenly turning rather religious out of nowhere by the reveal that the reason everyone disappeared is because the bad guy got a piece of heaven and has been using it as a power source. Yeah, it's definitely a very big wasted potential, and that is why it ended up on this list. Number 4. Four Blind Mice is the tale of an Alex Cross book, number 8 within the lineup, where Alex Cross is asked by his friend to help clear the name of a old Vietnam War buddy after he's convicted of murder that he didn't do. Now, the story is, at its best, boring. This book, it just did not handle the mystery well. Within 6 pages, you already know who the killers are because Patterson has chapters written from their point of view. So even by 6 pages in, you already know who the killers are. You already know the big mystery reveal. Alex Cross kind of meanders about on the mystery for a long period of time and makes really dumb decisions in the midst of battle and stuff. They're met with a strange amount of resistance. There's also people who are incompetent purely for the sake of the plot. At one point, Alex Cross finds a eyewitness who specifically states that the people who were murdered were killed by 3 people that he saw from his bedroom window. And he goes to tell the military police about this. And they just blow it off. Like, he's just a kid. He probably thought he saw other stuff. And it's just one of those. There's no reason for people to act like this except to force the mystery to continue longer. Especially as the murders have a very clear calling card. The murders have a very clear style. And the murders continue after the guy who's been accused of murder is put in jail. They're, like, legitimately, while Alex Cross is on base trying to find what happened, you get a few chapters from the point of view of the killers where they kill a teenage prostitute and a state trooper and do the exact same thing to the bodies they did with these murders. So when that came in, that should have been a clear, hold on, more murders? And mind you, this isn't the first murder they've done either before they convicted this guy. They had done a whole bunch of other murders on other bases other people had been convicted of. Again, this mystery does not hold up when you really think about it. Especially around the halfway point, Alex Cross just kind of decides, I'm done with this. I'm going to go on a nice vacation. I'm going to go hang out with my girl as the innocent man that I promised to help is being executed. But the worst of it all, for me personally, was that this book really made me reevaluate what I liked about Patterson's works. Back in the day, at least in high school and middle school, I really enjoyed Patterson's work. I was deep into the Maximum Ride series. I really liked Daniel X, even if it did get a bit confusing for me. And I even remember picking up a couple of his other odd books, but I can't remember their names off the top of my head. And I remember liking them. However, reading Alex Cross, which is supposedly supposed to be one of his best works, and realizing how facile and bland his writing was all this time makes me think, did I like those books because they were good, or did I like them because they were easy reading? It's just, that's ultimately why it's here. This may have retroactively ruined my past experiences with his other works. But with that, let's move on. Number 3. Doctor Who's Only Human by Gareth Roberts. When it comes to expanded universe novels, to me there's a couple of things that every expanded universe novel has to keep in mind when it's written. The first is that just because this is set in a specific fandom doesn't necessarily mean the person picking up this book is going to be completely familiar with it. There may be someone who thought this premise sounded interesting but hadn't experienced Doctor Who in its normal standard. Or like with Star Wars EU. Yes, most people know what Star Wars is and most people have experienced it. But the EU is such a complicated web of other stories that you can't just write the EU books with the belief that the person reading it is already caught up to where this is at. Unless it's a sequel to an already written book. In which case that's fine, but that's not my point here. Doctor Who's Only Human is a perfect example of how to write an EU book wrong. Not only does it feel like it's only written for the fans, as in, if you pick this book up, you're already a fan of Doctor Who. You don't need anything else. You don't need to be described who Jack Harkness is. You don't need to be told who Rose Tyler is. You don't need to be described what the ninth generation of the Doctor is like. You don't need to know all that because you already know. Otherwise, why are you reading this book? 2, the story is unfocused and confused. You have several plot lines which are just there that feels like to pad out time. Well, in the story, it tries to use them as a sort of a comedic break between the actions of the book. Because it's a book, it just feels like it's a constant diversion from the actual plot line, rather than a quick break to just relieve the tension. Overall, I honestly would say that I would put money down that this book was just a script that had been cut before they filmed it, and Gareth Roberts decided, well, I'm going to write it into a book instead, but didn't do any of the necessary work to make the transition from script to book, because you can't just take a script and make it a book. Well, I mean, without just making a script book, like with Cursed Child or something. You have to actually put effort into completely rearranging it, because a script is not written like a book. Like I said, I'd put money down that's what that is, and that's what made the book so bad. I really don't recommend this one if you're into this series. But for some reason, from what I found online, it's one of the best reviewed ones, which terrifies me because I have a couple of others up there. Without further ado, let's move on. Number 2. Night Flight by David and Diane Munson. Most recent book that I've reviewed on this channel comes in at number 2, and for good reason if you've all seen my review. I go into heavy detail in the review. I highly recommend that you check it out if you really want to understand what I'm talking about. But this book is just an inconsistent, confused mess that doesn't know what it wants to be. That is the easiest way to describe everything wrong with this book. There's 1,000 different plot lines that they don't do anything with. It feels like they just kept getting bored and writing a new plot line in without wrapping up the previous one. There was constant diversions of other things that just happened to happen. They had no point in the story, like a tornado that randomly strikes them, or a python that gets stuck in their garden and they have to call animal control on. Or it's just one of those. There's no through line for what happens. Factor in a main character who's 15, acts like she's 8, and is just clear that David and Diane Munson don't know how to write kids at all. Dialogue that sounds like it's 2 AI robots talking to each other back and forth pretty much every time. Characters who will just pop into scenes. Plot lines that exist solely to push a Jesus preaching message. Like, I have nothing wrong with Jesus preaching, but it has to fit within the book and narrative itself for me to forgive it. As opposed to this, where a whole new narrative was invented just to push that thing. Otherwise, it wouldn't have fit, even though there were points where it could have fit within the main plot line. And worst of all, again, this book doesn't know what it wants to be, even on a outside the narrative level. It wants to be its brand new series aimed at kids, but also wants to be a sequel to a adult-oriented book called The Joshua Covenant, about a spy in Israel trying to deal with a biblical prophecy while jets explode and people fight to the death. There really isn't. It's just, there's nothing good about this book that I can personally think of. So I'm going to go ahead and say, I'll cut it here. If you really want to know my opinion on why this book is so bad, you want to see a real big breakdown on it, check out my video. With that, we move on to the deepest, darkest pits of Mount Doom. Let us find what is in there. But first, some dishonorable mentions. Typhoon Rising. Typhoon Rising was one of the other bad books that I reviewed for my November catalog. It was actually the first one since I did Mass Effect as in 7-day treat. However, Typhoon Rising, while bad, I would not say is nearly as bad as the other 2 books I'd reviewed that year. Typhoon Rising was a bad book, yes, don't get me wrong. But when compared to the others on this list, I think its gravest sin was just that it was boring. Yes, there was some offensive ways that they used women in that book, and the villains were just so stupid, making decisions solely based on what the plot needs by assuming the best scenario had happened for them, which doesn't make sense based on some of the things I pointed out. Again, it's all in my review if you want to check it out. But ultimately, like I said, the worst thing about this book is that it was just a very boring thing trying to be a spy thriller. Jack Reacher's Killing Floor. This fought very heavily for the 4th place spot on the list. However, in the end, I gave it to James Patterson's Four Blind Mice because of the fact that it completely changed my feelings to all the previous works that I'd already liked. But Jack Reacher's Killing Floor is a very bland, poorly written book. Well, yeah, poorly written book whose mystery is not only strange, but very anticlimactic. I know this Amazon series has been very well liked, but honestly, I don't understand the hype behind the book at all. Jack Reacher isn't very likable. The mystery has a very anticlimactic reveal. Like, the people doing these horrible actions are doing it for the most mundane of reasons that you're just disappointed by the reveal. In addition, this book contains the line, "It was about as distinctive as the most distinctive thing that you can think of." And that should be all I have to say. Moving on. The Celibate by Steve Hudgens. I pretty much went into this with my my horror anthology, horror quickie review, the one that killed Afrodo. Check it out if you haven't. But The Celibate is a short story that I read for my, Books of Blood challenge in October. Now, I read this because it seemed interesting. I was trying to meet all the genres that I wanted to. But The Celibate is a story that is only not on the list because it is just so bad it is hilarious. It sacrifices a very good, maybe good by comparison, but a very good story about an addict struggling with his addiction, to tell the tale of how women are alien invaders to our Earth who have completely genetically restructured the asexual men species into being basically their, hump slaves. And it's just one of those, it's just so absurd and so stupid that I can't help but laugh at it. And I do recommend you read it just to read it, but it's just, when in comparison to everything else I read, it's definitely one of the worst books I've read. One of the worst stories. The Feral Detective by John Lethem. The Feral Detective was one of the few books that I DNF'd this year. Mostly because I could not read it anymore. I didn't like any of the other characters. The main character felt like a girl who had never let out her hormones before, and it was just all coming spread out over the pages. Our main detective, the Feral Detective, is a guy who's supposed to be enigmatic and withdrawn, but comes off as creepy as hell. There's constant forced political pandering in this. I would say pandering. It's not even really pandering. It's just constant politics shoved in. And I don't mean just it's there and I annoy it. No, I mean it's literally just shoved in. Combined with a coupling that has absolutely no chemistry whatsoever, but is such a heavy focus that I ended up quitting at page 69 because that page lives up to the thing you're thinking of right now if you have a dirty mind. So, with that, we'll move on. Number 1. The Last Layover by Stephen C. Bird. Yeah, for those of you who've seen my channel, you know this is the book that was going to end up as number 1. It's the book that I've complained about pretty much since I've read it. It's a basic libertarian wet dream where the government that they don't like, that's currently in charge, decides we're going to kill everyone who doesn't agree with us. And the whole of the U.S. society has completely collapsed because for some reason in their mind it makes more sense to completely burn something down just to rebuild it. But it's a book that is clearly just pandering to a political audience, is clearly got a main character who's just a stand-in for the author, and is a major Mary Sue on top of that. the two main characters aren't even distinguished enough between themselves that the author has to resort to trying to give one a catchphrase that's stupid. Everyone in this book is just unlikable as all hell. Literally, there's a scene in this where someone is killed, and the person who killed him, which is supposed to be a good person, mocks him for not being enough of a man to provide for his family. Another scene where people are praying and saying, you think, yeah, God, thanks for helping us. It's a shame all those people who didn't believe you and haven't prepared are suffering so much. And that's basically how it comes off. That's not how it's worded, but it's how it comes off. And factor in that with the use of some really disgusting, sensitive topics for the pure shock value, and so our white bread protagonists can clench their fist, raise it to the sky, and rue the other side for the horrible things that they've done. And it's just a book all around that's not only badly written, but also just disgusting in pretty much in every other way. I would never recommend anyone pick up this book, and I would just say if you find a copy, burn it. Don't buy it, burn it, because if you buy it, they get the money still. Disclaimer, don't actually go into a bookstore and light stuff on fire. Okay? Please. This is a joke. This is a joke. But yeah, with that, we'll come to an end on the top 5 worst books of 2022. That's my list. So you guys may disagree, you guys may agree. However, I want to know, what was your top 5 worst books of 2022? Does it match up with mine? Do you agree with what I've said? Who knows? Let me know now. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've made it this far, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. With that being said, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having. Even the bad ones, especially because you get to toss them in lava at the end.